Welcome to this Breakaway Crochet tutorial. This video supplements the joined 2-round granny square entry in the Breakaway Motif Library, and I'll be going over how to crochet this swatch using Breakaway crochet techniques. This swatch is based on a very traditional small granny square motif. It is a 2-round square, and we will be connecting the squares together with a solid join. You are probably used to crocheting granny squares one at a time, with the added hassle of having to then join them together and also having to weave in endless yarn tails. But in this video, I'm going to show you how to use my breakaway crochet techniques to work these squares continuously. This means we're not going to be working these squares individually. Instead, we will be working this swatch in one piece, as if we were crocheting a back and forth type of stitch. This means the swatch comes hot off the hook, completely finished, with all the squares automatically joined together and free of the usual yarn tails to weave in. To make all this possible, I will be demonstrating the breakaway techniques we will be using, such as how to continuously break away from one square to the next one, how to work a restored double crochet, and special stitches for joining the squares together as we go. You may also be interested in further information that you can find on the breakawaycrochet.com website, such as the written instructions for this swatch, any currently available projects that use the 2-round granny square, and further resources covering the Breakaway Crochet Method in general. Please see the description for links. So let's start with the very first square of the foundation row, and to help you understand what's going on, I'm going to compare the old way of doing things with the breakaway crochet way. In the old way, you would have started with chain 4 and then slip stitched into the first chain to make a ring, and then chain 3 to make the first double crochet of the round. But to be able to work the squares continuously, we need to start the squares in a totally different way. So each time we start a new square, do it like this instead. Start with 3 yarn over the hook, and then make a floating ring. To do that, do another yarn over, pinch the yarn close to the hook. Do another yarn over and pinch the new yarn along with the other pinched loop. Do another yarn over and draw through the 2 pinched loops. So these 2 loops here are the floating ring, and they replace the chain 4 that we would have done before. Let's continue by making the first double crochet of the round, and to do that we use the first 3 loops that are already on the hook. So do yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, pull through 2, and that has replaced the chain 3 we would have done as the first double crochet of the round. Instead, we've done it just like this. So here we have the replacement for chain 4, slip stitch, chain 3. Now we've got 2 extra loops on the hook that we are not going to be using for the first round. So to give us a little bit more room to work, we're going to temporarily release this middle loop off the hook, and we do that just by flipping what we already have over the hook, and that gives us a little bit of slack yarn. And this loop is just going to hang out until we get to the second round. So we're going to totally ignore this loop as we work the first round of this square. So from now on, we just pretty much continue as we normally would with the granny square. Let's do another double crochet, and again we work that into a floating ring, into those 2 loops we made before. And again, we're trying not to catch in the slack yarn as we go. Let's work our 3rd double crochet, and that has made our first granny cluster, the 3 double crochets. Continue around with the 2 chain, granny cluster. Again, I'm keeping this slack yarn sort of behind the work so I'm not catching it in. Chain 2, granny cluster, chain 2, granny cluster. And now that we have the 4th granny cluster, we're ready to close this round. We do that with chain 1 and a single crochet into the first double crochet of the round. We do a single crochet here so that the hook ends up right in the corner, and that helps us on the next row. So now for round 2, we deal with all this extra stuff we had lingering on the hook on round 1. Now remember, in the old days, you would have done chain 3 here to do the first double crochet of this next round. But again, we're not going to do it that way. Instead, we're going to get the slack yarn back on the hook as a yarn over, and we do that by flipping our little motif that we already have on the hook from back to front, which twists that yarn back around the hook, and we're all set up to do our first double crochet of the next round. Let's finish that up with yarn around, pull through 2, yarn around, pull through 2. There's our first double crochet of round 2. Continue with 2 more double crochets in the same space, and you have to kind of pull that apart sometimes. It can be hard to see on that first round or the second round. And we're only working the first, or just 1 granny cluster in this first space to start off with. Chain 1, go to the next space and work 2 granny clusters, with chain 2 in between each one. Chain 1, and repeat that in the next space. Another chain 1, and in this next space, which will be the 4th space, we're only going to just do the first granny cluster here, because we have now reached the breakaway point for this square. That means it's time now to pause work on this square and move to the next one that will sit just to the right of it. So, just to review, we start the next granny square just like we did for this first one here. That is with 3 yarn overs, floating ring, yarn over, pull through 2 loops twice, release the middle loop on the hook by flipping our work around the hook. Continue with 2 more double crochets into the floating ring to make the first granny cluster. Again, we're just leaving this loop out of the way. We don't need it till round 2. Continue with chain 2 granny cluster into the floating ring until we have 4 granny clusters. And in this round with chain 1 single crochet into the first stitch of the round. So that is in the pattern abbreviated as working the first round. That will be the same for every square we start. So there's really no need to re-explain that every time. It will be the same every time. Right, let's start with round 2 now. And remember, we use the slack yarn and the loop that's already behind the hook here to make the first double crochet of the round. So rewrap the slack yarn around the hook by flipping round 1 from back to front, and we now have restored the double crochet by pulling through 2 loops twice. Now, as we work the rest of this first side, we need to connect it up or join it to this side here of the first square. So here we're joining as we go. And we do that with some special grab stitches, as I call them. The first grab stitch will be a grab double crochet. And what we need to think about is where this stitch connects up on the first square. In this case, it will be the 3rd stitch behind the hook. So we're going to count back 1, 2, 3, and this is where we're going to connect the next stitch we make. And we do that by dipping the hook back and just grabbing the back loop of that stitch, and we switch focus back to the square we're working on and find our first space, do a yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over and pull through all 3 loops on the hook to make that grab double crochet. So again, what that's done is it's connected this next double crochet of the round to the corresponding one on the previous square. From now on in this side, we just need to find the next stitch to grab onto. So here's the next stitch, just go through the back loop. And let's work the next double crochet in this corner. And you can see how things are starting to connect up. So that was our first granny cluster. We now have a chain, so let's do a grab chain. Again, it's just that very next stitch, go into the back loop, And since it's just a chain stitch, we can pull that through straight away. Let's start our next granny cluster in the next corner. And again, we find the next stitch of the previous side, grab the back loop, come over and work our double crochet. Again, on the last pull through, we're going through 3 loops because we're attaching that grab loop. Do that one more time. The second double crochet, one more grab double crochet, and we end this side with a grab chain. So we're just going to grab the first chain of that corner through the back loop. Oops, I missed it. Sometimes it helps to look on the back side to see where you're going. All right, so I'll grab that back loop and just pull through to make a grab chain. So there's our side connected up. And actually it's going to be oriented like this. Okay, so just continue now with this side as we normally would. The chain 1 and the second granny cluster in this corner. Chain 1, granny cluster, chain 2, granny cluster in the next corner. Chain 1 and just 1 granny cluster in the 4th space. And that's as far as we're going on this second square. So again, we've reached the breakaway point, so we're going to work 2 more squares on this row, and the 2 squares are worked exactly like the second one here. So just repeat this square 2 more times, and I'll meet you at the end of the row. And that's our first 4 squares established on the foundation row complete. And now for a return row, what we do is we work across the top edge here, finishing off the 4th side of each square. Just working our way back to the first square, and that pretty much is very traditional, pretty much as well. We start with the space we're on. We've done 1 granny cluster, so continue with the chain 2 for the corner and the second granny cluster in this space. Chain 1, and now let's work the second granny cluster that belongs in this next space. So we pretty much finished this corner, except for normally we would have chain 2 here, but what we're going to do now is we're going to simultaneously finish this corner and kind of jump to the next square. So here's where things are different. In this case, just do chain 1, and we're going to do a single crochet between the 2 squares. And I like to do that, see this kind of horizontal piece here? I like to go through that. And there's another horizontal piece behind the hook. So I like to grab those 2 threads as I draw up a loop. You don't have to do that exactly the same way, as long as you're kind of picking up 2 threads between the squares. Okay, so I've drawn up a loop, and let's finish a single crochet. So what that's again done is it's closed this corner. The single crochet acts as kind of that first chain of the corner on both squares. So kill two birds with one stone there. Let's continue on the next square with the second chain of the corner, chain 1, and the second granny cluster for that corner. Chain 1. Let's work the second granny cluster of the next space. Chain 1, single crochet between the two squares, chain 1, and move on to the next square and do the same thing. And when we get to the end of the row, again, just finish the next corner with the second granny cluster, chain 1, and just work a granny cluster in the next space. We're not going to finish this last corner because we now need to break away to the next row, which is called a joined foundation row. So again, we're going to start a new row above the first one here. We start the first square of the joined foundation row in exactly the same way. There's round 1 worked. Start the second round in the same way with a restore DC. And we're going to join this side to this side here. So as we're working these stitches, we're also joining them to the side before. And just remember, on the first stitch of the side, we skip back 3 stitches. 1, 2, 3. That is where we begin joining our stitches. They joined double crochet into the same space. And one more to make our granny, or a grabbed granny cluster, so to speak, in that first space. Again, continue with a grab chain stitch and grab granny cluster in the next space. And we've got to do one more grab stitch, that grab chain in that corner there. Let's put the hook through and pull through a loop. So that's joined that first side. And now we're going to work this side here. And of course, it doesn't have any joins. So we're going to continue with chain 1, another granny cluster in this space, chain 1, and just the first granny cluster in the next space. And now we're going to add this square, and notice we've got 2 sides to join in this time. So I'll just take you through that. Again, start with the first round. Work our restore DC to begin the second round. And start grabbing our double crochets. and work to the first granny cluster of the next space. Alright, so we've done that first granny cluster. Do a grab chain in the corner. And because we're continuing on, we're coming around to go here. Before we start this side, I like to do a slip stitch into this kind of diagonal corner here before we go on. That just kind of prevents a gap that can sometimes happen. So I just like to do a slip stitch in there. And now we carry on along, grabbing these stitches as we work this side here. So the next grab stitch is a chain stitch. Just go again in the back loop, grab it up, and pull through. Do our grab granny cluster in the same space. You can see how we're kind of always pivoting back and forth. Grab that chain stitch, the grab chain. And a grab granny cluster in the next space. And let's grab just that first chain of the corner before we move on. And let's work the third side without any joins as we normally would, starting with the chain 1 granny cluster. Chain 1 and the first granny cluster in the next space. We're ready to break away now to the next square. And you can see how that slip stitch kind of makes this seam look nice and square and neat. So don't forget to do that. Okay, so adding on 2 more squares, again, just like we've worked this one here. I'll meet you at the end of this row. And that's how our joined foundation row should look. Time for another return row. And again, we are finishing off the tops of these squares here. That is done just like we've done on the first row, starting with the chain 2 granny cluster in the same space, chain 1 granny cluster in the next space, chain 1 single crochet between the squares, chain 1 granny cluster in the next space, and so on. And again, when you get to the last corner here, we're going to add a third row. So when you get to this last corner, just end with the first granny cluster. And there we are at the end of this return row. Now just for a little bit more practice, we're going to add another row of squares up the top here. It is done exactly like we've done for this row of squares here. So start with another joined foundation row just like we've done, and a return row. And when I get to the end of that last square, I'll show you what to do next. So now we have our third row of squares on, And let's finish this swatch off now by finishing off the left edge. So as you can see, the sides of these two squares are not finished, and that last corner is not done there. And basically, this is just a return row where we just turn the corner, continue around with a chain 2 and a granny cluster in the same space, chain 1, granny cluster in the next space, chain 1, single crochet between the two squares, chain 1, continue to the next square with a granny cluster in the next space, chain 1, granny cluster in the next space, chain 1, single crochet between the squares. Now we're at the end. Again, we know we're at the end because we've got the first yarn tail there. So continue with chain 1 and slip stitch into the next stitch. And we're done. So if you are able to manage this swatch here, that will prepare you well for any projects that use the granny square in this sort of arrangement. Please write in if you need any more help or have questions. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.